Will President Trump strike Iran? Today, the president called on, quote, Iranian patriots to keep protesting. He also said this.
I've canceled all meetings with the Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops. And all I say to them is help is on its way.
Help is on the way? What kind of help to the Iranian protesters does the president mean? Activists say thousands of protesters have already been killed protesting this repressive regime. And tomorrow, a 26-year-old protester is scheduled to be hanged. He is charged with waging war against God. There are reports that his hanging will be in public as a means of intimidation to other protesters. And despite Iran's widespread internet blackout, information is still getting out. But how? Iran has jammed Elon Musk's Starlink satellites, and the White House says President Trump spoke with Musk to get those satellites back up and running. And as Trump weighs U.S. military action against Iran, Tehran says it is ready for war. Foreign Affairs correspondent Alex Salvi joins me with the latest. Alex?
Yeah, Iran says that it's still willing to take part in nuclear negotiations, is what it originally said, but it's yet to be seen if President Trump is still in the mood for any talking. As you said right there, he's condemning what he referred to as the senseless killing of protesters. The president cutting off communication with Iran until that ends. And in fact, he took to Truth Social earlier today to lay out exactly what he's looking for from the people of Iran. He says Iranian patriots need to keep protesting. He's calling on them to take over their institutions. And this is notable. Save the names of the killers. He says they will pay a big price for their actions, adding that help is on the way before delivering a very familiar slogan of Make Iran Great Again. Now, all of these remarks coming as many videos coming out of the country confirming reports of Iranian soldiers opening fire on crowds of protesters over the weekend. This is just one of them. Several reports now indicate that over 2,000 people have been killed since the demonstrations first began 16 days ago, but that number is estimated to be much higher given the lack of transparency from the regime. President Trump just moments ago was asked what he believes the number is.
Nobody's been able to give me an accurate number. I have heard numbers from everything's a lot. One is a lot. But I've heard numbers much lower and I've heard numbers much higher. We'll be knowing. We're probably going to find out over the next 24 hours. I think it's a lot.
And now the president's national security team meeting as of this hour to discuss a range of different options, including cyber, psychological, and military action. But Trump says we'll have to find out what U.S. assistance looks like. Axios is also reporting that White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff met secretly over the weekend with the exiled former Crown Prince of Iran to discuss the ongoing protests, a man who is offering himself up as the transitional leader if the regime falls. Of course, Greta, a scenario that becomes much more likely if the U.S. military gets involved.
But the prince who you're referring to, who Steve Witkoff met, hasn't been to Iran since, since at least the revolution, 1979. So he hasn't been there. So I don't even know. If this regime were to crumble, I don't, it's not necessarily going to be the prince.
Exactly, and I think that's a problem that a lot of people have with this entire situation. The Iranian people, of course, after 47 years, don't exactly know what a future post this regime looks like. We could see whether or not President Trump ends up taking action. Perhaps it is a similar type of situation that we saw in Venezuela, where you take off the head of the snake, if you will, Ayatollah Khamenei, and then work with the military or something like that. But the idea, the prospect of completely removing this regime altogether just leaves the idea that there's no hierarchy that's left after that.
But there's got to be something there. And when Iran says it is ready for war, it sounds like the mouse that roared, unless, of course, it has some sort of nuclear weapon or it's gotten some weapons from Russia, because we humiliated, or the United States humiliated Iran in June, the regime, over 12 days.
Right. You saw the response after that. We saw that the United States, Israel, as well as some European allies were able to deter Iran's counterattack against Israel almost across the board. You may remember they even launched some attacks against U.S. military facilities across the Middle East, once again, to no avail. So as far as Iran's, what they have on their head, as President Trump will say, their cards that they have to play, they really don't have much, especially after last year's 12-day war.
I'll tell you the one thing I always worry about with Iran is, and that's chemical weapons, because they did unleash that years ago against Iraq.
And
they may not have a huge nuclear program right now, but they do probably have that.
They have a large ballistic missile program. They have chemical weapons, as you noted right there. But perhaps the most scary thing that a lot of military officials fear is the sleeper cells that are presumably taking place across the world. You may remember when the Biden administration left up on the southern border for 4 years, one of the big concerns was that people from the Middle East, bad actors, could have gotten in that way. There is evidence to suggest that there were terrorist different organizations that entered the United States through that platform. Hopefully, this administration has gotten that taken care of.
Well, Iran certainly has been the problem. They've funded Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and others. And in terms of Hezbollah, there is a Hezbollah presence in Venezuela, and there has been for years. So even in our own hemisphere, they've put their tentacles.
Exactly, and who this really affects as well, including the tariffs that President Trump announced last night, the 25% tariffs on anybody doing business with Iran, that still hurts Russia and China, namely India as well, people who buy Iranian oil. But what President Trump did to Venezuela, that undermined those countries as well. And when it comes to Iran, I just want to point out one thing that I think is very personal for President Trump when it comes to this issue is the fact that Iran has been trying to assassinate him for the better part of 5 years. So I think that is something that President Trump won't forget when he's carrying out these actions or deciding what action to take.
Well, I guess it's stay tuned. Alex Selby, thank you very much. Nice to see you. Research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Iran program, Janatan Sayeh, joins me. Good afternoon, sir. And tell me, what happens if, hypothetically, the regime this repressive regime in Iran leaves? They head off to Russia or someplace else. What happens?
So we have to see how that would take place, whether it would be through a kinetic strike from the U.S., whether it would be non-kinetic ways of going about it. Because what we do know for a fact is that Iranian protesters are fighting an uneven battle against this regime that has opened fire on civilians. The numbers, as you mentioned, are in the thousands. But what we do know about the Iranian society and where it's headed is that it's very secular. It's an educated society. So it really comes down to the power vacuum after how the regime would leave and what would happen immediately after. And the opposition does have a plan in place. There is a defection strategy that has been developed. And it is the first time that we're seeing Iranians really responding to the calls of the Crown Prince. So there is a symbolism going on for the Iranian protesters that they can rally around. But again, as it comes through the details, it depends on whether U.S. engagement was going to directly be decapitating the leadership that would enable the mid-level officials to defect, or how that's going to transpire.
Do you have any information, because even President Trump has said that the numbers are rather squishy, he's getting all sorts of different numbers, and so are we. Do you have any idea how many protesters have been killed since this started?
We can go back to previous examples. So in 2019, when they shut down the internet, it was confirmed that they killed about 2,000 people within 48 hours. And back then, it was not an existential threat to them. This time it is. So it is very likely that we're looking at a very catastrophic number, realistically, in the thousands, presumably certainly more than 2,000. The latest we've heard is about 12,000, and that is believable, given that there's videos of regime officials opening fire on protesters with automatic weapons, paired with the fact that there's Hezbollah and Iraqi PMF fighters in place. And these are not crowd control militias. These are terrorist groups that are only trained to kill civilians.
Well, you say it's an existential threat, but in 2009, we thought that perhaps during the Obama administration that the regime might fall. You mentioned 2019. Now we're at 2026, and it looks so bleak. Yet, what makes you think that the regime, or do you think the regime, is going to fall?
I was actually in the streets in 2009. It's interesting you mentioned that. And at the time, the idea was reform through the system. Even though there were many anti-regime elements present, the idea was we can work within the framework of the Islamic Republic to reach somewhere. The reform has died years ago. And Iranians think there is no way out but through. And what really sets this wave apart is, number one, 2025 has been a very awful year. There's an environmental collapse, there's an economic collapse, and executions are on the surge, paired with the fact that this time around was the only case where Iranians actually responded to calls of protest by one figure. So that really tells you where society is headed. But of course, when we talk about the prospects of regime change, it's an uneven battle. And without external support, it is unlikely for it to go anywhere, because you're talking about a terrorist regime that effectively enabled the murder of 500,000 Syrians in a country that was not even theirs. So they're very likely to implement the same strategy as long as they're not deterred by whether Israeli or American strikes.
Well, if all goes as planned, tomorrow there will be a protester who will be hanged publicly as a means of intimidation to other protesters. So, I mean, they're reaching into their into their playbook that they've done before, using public hangings.
They do, and I do actually have vivid memories of them doing that in public as an intimidation tactic. But Iranians are aware of this repression, and it's turned into an everyday thing. We are seeing the largest, most significant numbers of civilian deaths Nonetheless, the protests are continuing. We're seeing videos right now from the ground. It is nighttime in Tehran, and you cannot just imagine the amount of people that are still out despite the crackdowns, despite the internet outages. So really, Iranians are looking at this as not just a protest wave, but as a revolt. They're really optimistic given one caused by the Crown Prince and, of course, the rhetorical support from President Trump. So that has really inspired a major movement. Yes, yet to be seen.
Let me stop here just a minute. What support are you talking about? Because there's, people here in this country are very wary of things. We talk about boots on the ground. We've seen what happened in June when the president and also Prime Minister Netanyahu, they did a lot of damage to the nuclear facilities in Iran. But what is it that what is it that protesters expect or think the United States could do to help them?
You're right to point out that we're all aligned, even protesters, that there's no expectation of boots on the ground similar to Iraq and Afghanistan. That's not really desirable by anybody. So we have kinetic and non-kinetic options. Non-kinetic options, of course, are providing internet, psychological warfare against the regime, cyber attacks, or perhaps providing a strike fund to support the laborers that are striking, paired with other means that would really enable the protesters to go on. That said, even if all these factors were in place, it's debatable whether the regime would stop its crackdown of murdering people. So when we get to the kinetic option, we would have to look at the framework of the 12-day war. So, of course, it started with the military installations. You're talking about ballistic missile stockpiles, drone manufacturing, but that's not necessarily what the protests are referring to. They're referring to going after the repression apparatus, specifically the entities that are involved in killing people. So you're talking about our Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps bases, a designated FTO that is directly contributing to crackdowns. You're talking about the propaganda apparatus that is putting out information, trying to deter the protesters. So really, we're talking about repression, and the people with the guns against civilians would be the target. That is something the protesters have been calling for.
Well, there's certainly a lot of unknowns and a terrible situation going on there. Janatan Sayeh, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.